The rain wasn't just falling, it was punishing. Hana stood under the precariously thin awning of a closed convenience store, watching the ink of her resume bleed into a gray smudge on her only professional blazer. This interview had been her last shot at stability, and now, standing in a soaked polyester blend that clung to her like a second, shivering skin, she felt the crushing weight of every no she'd heard this month. The cafe at the corner, the Gilded Lily, was warm, amber-lit, and far beyond her budget, but she ducked inside just to stop her teeth from chattering. Near the entrance, a heavy brass coat rack stood laden with the garments of Seoul's elite. That's when she saw it. A charcoal gray trench coat, double-breasted and thick enough to withstand a typhoon. It sat alone, draped over a mahogany chair near the door, seemingly abandoned by a distracted patron. Just to the subway, she whispered to herself, her conscience losing the battle against hypothermia. I'll bring it back tomorrow. It's just a loan. She slipped into it, the silk lining sliding over her damp shoulders with a luxury that made her breath hitch. It was heavy and smelled of cold rain and a sharp, expensive sandalwood that felt strangely intimate. She didn't look back. She sprinted into the deluge, the coat acting as an impenetrable fortress against the Seoul sky. It wasn't until she reached the cramped safety of her studio apartment that the adrenaline faded, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. She hung the coat on the back of her door, the fabric still shedding water in heavy beads. Under the harsh buzz of her overhead light, something on the lapel caught the glare. It was a silver tiger hand-stitched into the charcoal wool with microscopic precision, its eyes made of tiny, piercing obsidian. A sudden, sharp vibration rattled against the wooden door. Hana froze. The sound was coming from the inner pocket. She reached in, her fingers trembling, and pulled out a sleek, gold-plated burner phone. The screen flickered to life, illuminating her pale face with a string of messages that made her blood turn to ice. The shipment is at the pier. The Viper is waiting. Boss, the elders are questioning the delay. Give the word. And then, a final message arrived as she watched. I see you moving, little thief. Stay put. I'm coming to get what's mine. Hana dropped the phone as if it had burned her. She hadn't just borrowed a jacket to hide from the rain. She had wrapped herself in the authority of Kang-Dae, the man who ruled the city's shadows, a man who didn't believe in accidents, only provocations. The air in the skyscraper's lobby was as cold as the rejection Hana had just received. She clutched her plastic folder, the one containing 5 copies of a resume that no one seemed to want, and stepped out into the Seoul evening. She had expected the usual humid drizzle of early summer, but the sky had other plans. It was a deluge, a violent, blinding wall of water that turned the city's neon lights into smeared, jagged streaks of pink and blue. Her cheap blazer, already thinning at the elbows, was soaked through in seconds. The fabric turned heavy and sour-smelling, sticking to her skin like a reminder of everything she lacked. She ran, her heels splashing through deep puddles that ruined the leatherette finish, looking for any sliver of shelter. Most shops were already closing their doors against the storm, their metal shutters rattling like armor. Then she saw the sign for the Gilded Lily. It wasn't a place for someone with $20 in her bank account. It was a silent, upscale lounge where the windows were tinted a deep, mysterious gold, and the air smelled of imported tobacco and old money. Desperation outpaced her pride. Hana slipped through the heavy glass doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the sudden silence of the lounge wrapped around her. The interior was a cathedral of shadows and velvet. No one looked at her, which was a mercy. She was a drowned rat in a room full of peacocks. Near the entrance, tucked beside a mahogany partition, stood a coat rack. It was mostly empty, save for a single garment that seemed to radiate its own gravity. It was a charcoal gray trench coat, long and intimidatingly elegant. Hana stared at it. She was shivering so hard her teeth were audibly clicking together. Her apartment was a 20-minute walk from the subway station, and the forecast said the rain wouldn't let up for hours. She looked at the hostess stand. The podium was empty. The few patrons were huddled in deep booths far in the back, their voices lost to the low, humming jazz. I'll bring it back, she whispered, the lie tasting like copper in her mouth. Tomorrow morning. First thing. She reached out, her numb fingers brushing the wool. It was soft, unbelievably soft, yet heavy with a structured authority. She slipped it off the hanger and swung it over her shoulders. The warmth was instantaneous. It felt like being held by someone much larger and far more dangerous than herself. She didn't stop to check the pockets or look for a label. She simply pulled the collar up, pushed back out into the rain, and ran. The walk home was a blur of gray water and the rhythmic thumping of her own heart against her ribs. The coat was a marvel. The water didn't soak in. It simply beaded and rolled off the surface as if the fabric itself refused to be dirted by the city. By the time she reached her cramped, fourth-floor studio, she was exhausted, her adrenaline finally ebbing into a dull, throbbing guilt. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the patter of rain against the single, narrow window. Hana leaned against the door, catching her breath, and slowly unbuttoned the coat. She moved to the small kitchenette to hang it over the drying rack, intending to treat it with the reverence a five-figure garment deserved. As she lifted the coat, the weight shifted. A heavy, metallic thud echoed in the small room as something slipped from the inner lining and hit the linoleum floor. Hana froze. She looked down. Lying by her feet was a phone. It wasn't a standard smartphone. It was a rugged, gold-plated burner phone, its casing etched with a subtle, swirling pattern. As she watched, the screen flickered to life in the dim light of her kitchen. It didn't show a wallpaper or a clock. It showed a single notification from an unsaved number, the text glowing white against a black background. You have the coat. You have the phone. Now I have you. The coat suddenly felt very heavy on the rack, the silver tiger crest on the lapel catching the light like a predator's eye. Hana realized then that she hadn't just borrowed a jacket to stay dry. She had reached into the dark and pulled out something that was never meant to see the light of day. Hana stared at the gold-plated phone as if it were a live grenade. The text message glowed with a predatory sharpness against the dim, yellowed light of her studio apartment. 10 minutes. The words didn't just feel like a command, they felt like a sentence. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches as she looked from the phone to the charcoal gray coat hanging on her rickety drying rack. In the harsh light of her kitchen, the jacket was even more intimidating. The fabric was a wool-silk blend so fine it looked like liquid shadow, and the silver tiger stitched into the lapel seemed to snarl at her with every flicker of her overhead bulb. She reached out with a trembling hand to touch the sleeve, but pulled back before her skin could make contact. She had spent 3 years working part-time at a luxury department store while finishing her degree. She knew exactly what this was. This wasn't just a designer piece. It was a bespoke creation from a house that didn't put prices on their tags. It was a garment that cost more than her education, her apartment, and every possession she owned combined. And she had spilled rain, and perhaps a drop of cheap convenience store coffee, on it. The phone vibrated again, the sound loud and violent against the linoleum. 9 minutes. She grabbed the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. She wanted to reply, to apologize, to explain that she was just a girl who was cold and desperate and failing at life. But her throat was too tight to even swallow. Who was the viper? Who were the elders? The reality of her mistake began to settle in her stomach like lead. She hadn't stolen from a wealthy businessman. She had stolen from the kind of man who owned a gold-plated burner phone and spoke about stopping being polite. A few miles away, inside the hushed, leather-scented interior of a black sedan, Kang-Dae sat in the darkness. The only light came from a tablet mounted to the back of the front seat, displaying a digital map of the city. A small, crimson that was blinking rhythmically in a district he rarely visited, a cluster of aging apartments and narrow alleys. She hasn't moved, boss. His driver, a man with a scarred neck and eyes like flint, murmured. Kang-Dae didn't respond immediately. He leaned forward, the light from the screen carving the sharp, cruel angles of his face out of the shadows. He was a man of absolute order. Every thread of his life was meticulously curated, every subordinate a piece on a board he controlled with a heavy hand. To have a civilian, a girl, by the look of the grainy CCTV footage he'd reviewed from the lounge, simply walk off with his jacket was an anomaly he couldn't tolerate. It wasn't just about the jacket. It was about the phone in the pocket, containing the encrypted coordinates for a peer delivery that would shift the power balance of the Seoul underworld. But more than that, It was the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the act. "She's in a fourth-floor unit," Kang-Dae said, his voice a low, melodic friction. He tapped the screen, zooming in until the layout of the building was visible. "She's not a professional. A professional would have ditched the phone or moved to a dead zone. She's sitting there, watching the clock. Should I send the men in?" Kang-Dae felt a flicker of something, not quite amusement, but a dark, curious spark. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket, flicking it open and shut in a rhythmic, metallic clack-clack. "No, I want to see the face of someone who thinks they can borrow from me." Back in the apartment, Hana was spiraling. She tried to wipe a smudge of dirt from the hem of the coat with a damp paper towel, but she only succeeded in making the fabric damp. The panic was a physical weight now, pressing on her chest until she felt lightheaded. She looked at the door. She could run. She could take the coat and the phone and throw them into the Han River. But then she remembered the text. "I see you moving, little thief." She looked at the tiger on the lapel. It wasn't just embroidery. She felt a sudden, chilling realization as she ran her fingers along the inner seam of the collar. There was a small, hard bump hidden beneath the silk lining. A GPS tracker. She wasn't just holding his property. She was holding his leash. The phone lit up one last time. There was no text this time, only a countdown timer that had just hit 0. The silence of her apartment was suddenly shattered by the low, heavy rumble of a high-performance engine idling in the street 4 floors below. Hana crept to her window and pulled back the thin, gray curtain. A single black sedan sat directly under the streetlight. The rain was still pouring, but the car looked untouched by the storm, its polished surface gleaming like obsidian. The rear door opened, and a long, polished shoe stepped out into the puddle. Hana backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't waiting for her to bring it back anymore. He was here to collect. The rumble of the engine downstairs wasn't just a sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the loose glass in Hana's window frame. It felt like the low growl of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Hana didn't wait for the knock. She knew that if a man like the one who owned that phone came up those stairs, her flimsy wooden door wouldn't just open. It would cease to exist. With trembling hands, she folded the charcoal gray coat as neatly as her frantic nerves would allow. She tucked the gold-plated burner phone into the deep inner pocket, her fingers lingering on the silver tiger crest for a fraction of a second. It felt like touching a cold, sleeping beast. She threw on her old, thin cardigan, grabbed the heavy garment, and hurried out of her apartment, her breath coming in short, visible puffs in the damp hallway air. She reached the street level, the heavy scent of wet asphalt and expensive exhaust fumes filling her lungs. The black sedan was even more imposing up close, a sleek, armored shadow that seemed to swallow the light from the street lamps. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the rear door didn't just open. It swung wide with a silent, mechanical precision. A man stepped out, but it wasn't the owner. It was the driver, a mountain of a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jawline. He didn't speak. He simply gestured toward the darkened interior of the car. I was bringing it back," Hana stammered, holding the folded coat out like a shield. "I'm sorry. I just needed to get home. I didn't mean to." "Get in," the man said. His voice was like grinding stones. Hana's knees felt like water, but the sheer gravity of the situation pulled her forward. She slid into the back seat, and the door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the sound of the rain and the city. The interior was a vacuum of leather, cedar wood, and a chilling, clinical silence. Then, she felt the eyes. In the far corner of the wide bench seat, a man sat draped in shadows. He didn't move, but the air around him seemed to hum with a terrifying, controlled energy. This was Kang-Dae. Even in the dim light, he was breathtakingly sharp. His features were carved from ice. His hair swept back with a severity that matched the line of his mouth. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was in a white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were corded with steel. "The jacket," he said. His voice was a low, melodic friction that made the hair on Hana's arm stand up. "Here," she whispered, her voice cracking. She held it out. He didn't take it. Instead, he leaned forward, the light from a passing street lamp cutting across his face. His eyes were a dark, predatory amber, and they didn't look at the jacket. They looked at her, searching her face, her shaking hands, the cheap fabric of her cardigan. "Who sent you?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of a threat. "No one," Hana gasped. "It was raining. I was at the cafe and I was desperate. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who it belonged to." Kang-Dae let out a short, cold sound that might have been a laugh if there were any humor in it. He reached out, his long fingers snagging the lapel of the jacket she held and pulling it, and her, closer. The scent of sandalwood and something metallic, like a whetstone, overwhelmed her. "Desperate," he repeated, the word tasting like a lie in his mouth. "You walked into a lounge owned by the Kang Group. You bypassed 2 security details. You took the specific garment containing the pure coordinates. And now you're sitting in my car, trembling like a leaf, telling me it was the rain?" "It was," she cried, her eyes stinging with tears of pure terror. "I had an interview. I failed. I was soaking wet. Please, I don't even know what the Kang Group is." Kang-Dae gripped the jacket tighter, his knuckles turning white. He leaned in until his lips were inches from her ear. "The Vipers are getting creative," he whispered. "They send a girl who looks like she hasn't had a full meal in a week to play the part of the innocent thief. Do they think I'm soft, or do they just think I'm stupid?" "I'm not a spy," Hana sobbed, the reality of his world crashing down on her. I'm just a girl who borrowed a coat." He pulled back, his gaze lingering on the genuine terror in her eyes. For a second, a flicker of something unreadable passed over his face, a momentary break in the ice. But then he looked at the gold burner phone visible in the jacket pocket, and the mask returned. "You took something of mine," Kang-Dae said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, final tone. "In my world, there is no such thing as borrowing. There is only taking. And when you take from me, you belong to the debt." He tapped the glass partition. The car began to move, pulling away from the curb and into the dark heart of the city. "Where are you taking me?" Hana asked, her voice small and broken. Kang-Dae didn't look at her. He leaned back into the shadows, his profile as cold and unyielding as a mountain. "To find out exactly how much you're worth to the people who sent you. And if they don't want you back, I'll find another use for you." The car slowed to a halt, but the engine continued to hum like a low-frequency warning. They hadn't gone to a police station or a dark alley. Instead, the driver opened the door to a private underground garage, where the air was sterile and smelled of concrete and high-end air filtration. "Out," Kang-Dae commanded. Hana stumbled onto the polished floor, her legs feeling like overcooked noodles. She followed him into a private elevator that ascended in a stomach-flipping blur of speed. When the doors opened, she found herself in an office that was less a place of business and more a temple to minimalist power. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the rain-streaked skyline of Seoul, but the interior was all shadows, black marble, and harsh, architectural lighting. Kang-Dae walked to a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. He turned, the light catching the sharp ridge of his cheekbones, and held out a hand. "The jacket." "Now." Hana handed it over, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He took the garment with a practiced grace, laying it across the dark marble. He didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the fabric, his long, scarred fingers smoothing the charcoal wool with a reverent, terrifying precision. He reached into the inner pocket, retrieving the gold-plated phone and sliding it into his desk drawer without a word. Then, he turned the jacket inside out to inspect the silk lining. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. Hana watched his face, hoping for a flicker of mercy, but his expression only hardened. His nostrils flared, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that signaled a shift in the atmosphere. "What?" he began, his voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, vibrating bass. "Is this?" Hana peered closer, her stomach dropping through the floor. There, against the shimmering, silver-gray Italian silk of the inner lining, was a jagged, orange-tinted smudge. It was small, no larger than a coin, but against the perfection of the jacket, it looked like a wound. Worse than the stain was the smell that now wafted up, freed from the cold rain. The salty, artificial scent of spicy convenience store ramen. I was eating," Hana whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to her own ears. It must have splashed when I was running. I tried to wipe it, I swear. You wore a masterpiece into a gutter, Kang-Dae interrupted, his voice deceptively quiet. He leaned over the desk, his presence looming over her. This lining is hand-woven mulberry silk. It's treated with a proprietary finish. And you've defiled it with chemicals and MSG. He looked at the stain as if it were a personal betrayal, a smudge on his own soul. To a man who controlled every variable of his existence, this chaotic mark of poverty was an intolerable provocation. I'll pay for the dry cleaning, Hana said quickly, her voice trembling. I'll take it to the best place in the city. I'll work extra shifts. Dry cleaning. Kang-Dae let out a short, harsh sound that was devoid of mirth. You don't dry clean a Kong group uniform. The fabric is ruined. The integrity of the piece is gone. This requires a full restoration from the tailor in Milan who made it. He sat back in his heavy leather chair, crossing one leg over the other. He looked at her not as a spy, but as something far more irritating, a nuisance. The cost of the restoration, the shipping, and the insurance is $4,000, he said, his amber eyes pinning her to the spot. And then there is the matter of the disrespect fee. Forcing me to touch this. He gestured vaguely at the stain. That brings your total to $5,000. Hana felt the blood drain from her face. $5,000. She didn't even have 500. Her entire life savings wouldn't cover the buttons on that coat. I don't have that kind of money, she breathed, her hands clutching the hem of her cheap cardigan. Please. I'm just an illustrator. I'm looking for work. I can't pay you that. Kang-Dae leaned forward, the shadows of the office swallowing everything but the predatory glint in his eyes. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had just finished a calculation. I know you can't pay, he said. People like you never can. You think sorry is a currency, but in this room, it's worthless. He stood up, walking around the desk until he was standing directly in her personal space. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to his icy demeanor. He reached out, his thumb catching her chin and tilting her face up to meet his gaze. Since you can't pay in cash, you'll pay in time, he declared. You've stained my property, so now you'll help me clean up a few messes of my own. Until that 5,000 is worked off, you don't go to interviews. You don't go home unless I say so. You belong to the Kong group. He dropped his hand, his touch leaving a burning sensation on her skin. Congratulations, Hana, he said, his voice a cold, silken caress. You've just become the most expensive assistant in Seoul. Hana had expected to spend the morning on her hands and knees, scrubbing the obsidian floors of Kang-Dae's office with a toothbrush. Instead, she found herself trapped in a velvet-lined dressing room, surrounded by 3 silent women who moved with the clinical efficiency of surgeons. They didn't speak to her. They simply measured, cinched, and pinned until she was encased in a dress of midnight blue silk that felt less like clothing and more like a second skin. It was elegant, expensive, and entirely too revealing for someone who spent her life hiding in oversized cardigans. The debt is 5,000, remember? Kang-Dae's voice drifted through the heavy curtain, cool and detached. Consider this your uniform. You aren't here to look pretty. You're here to be a nuisance. When the curtain finally pulled back, Hana stood before him, feeling profoundly exposed. Kang-Dae was leaning against the far wall, already dressed in a black tuxedo that made him look like a lethal shadow. He didn't offer a compliment. His amber eyes swept over her from her trembling chin to the borrowed silver heels, landing finally on her face with a look of calculating satisfaction. Perfect, he murmured, stepping closer. He reached out, his gloved hand adjusting a stray lock of her hair with terrifying gentleness. You look exactly like what you are, a civilian who has stumbled into a world where she doesn't belong. You're nervous, you're out of your depth, and you're inevitably going to make a scene. That is exactly what I need from you tonight. I don't understand, Hana whispered, her heart performing a frantic tap dance against her ribs. What am I supposed to do? You are my personal assistant, he said, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, a gesture that was purely for control, yet sent a traitorous shiver down her spine. We are attending a gala hosted by the Choi family. Somewhere in that room is a man who thinks he can sell my shipment logs to the highest bidder. He's cautious, and he's watching me. He expects me to be cold, sharp, and focused. He leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and winter air wrapping around her. But if I'm distracted by a clumsy, beautiful girl who can't keep her champagne in her glass or her feet beneath her, he'll think I'm vulnerable. He'll get bold. He'll make his move. The car ride to the gala was a silent, suffocating blur. When they arrived, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi felt like physical blows. Kang-Dae didn't offer his hand. He placed it firmly on the small of her back, a possessive weight that guided her through the gilded doors of the ballroom. The room was a dizzying kaleidoscope of diamonds and forced smiles, but as soon as they entered, the temperature seemed to drop. People moved aside like the Red Sea, their whispers following in Kang-Dae's wake. "Stay close," he hissed in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "And try not to look like you're about to faint. Or do. Actually, fainting might be a better distraction." Hana tried to follow his lead, but the heels were treacherous and the eyes of Seoul's elite were like needles. As they moved through the crowd, Kang-Dae engaged in short, clipped conversations with men who looked like they'd never smiled in their lives. He was playing the part perfectly, half ignoring the powerful men in front of him to fuss over Hannah's crooked necklace or to catch her as she stumbled over a rug. To the room, he looked like a man hopelessly preoccupied with a new, beautiful toy. To Hana, every touch felt like a brand. When he pulled her closer to protect her from a passing waiter, she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart through the fine wool of his tuxedo. It was calm, terrifyingly calm, while hers was a frantic mess. "Smile, Hana," he commanded softly as a middle-aged man with sharp, calculating eyes approached them. "This is the one. Be the girl who borrowed the coat. Be the girl who has no idea she's standing in a room full of monsters." Hana looked up at him, her eyes wide and genuinely watery from the sheer pressure of the masquerade. For a fleeting second, Kang-Dae's gaze softened, not into kindness, but into a dark, intense curiosity. He squeezed her waist, a silent signal, and Hana did the only thing she knew how to do when she was terrified. She reached for a passing tray of champagne, her fingers accidentally, trembling just enough to send 2 flutes crashing to the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the refined hush of the room. Every head turned. The man with the sharp eyes smirked, his posture relaxing as he watched the mean Kang-Dae sigh and begin to dote on his clumsy assistant. The trap was set. Hana, dripping in champagne and shaking with real shame, realized she was the perfect bait. But as Kang-Dae wiped a drop of alcohol from her wrist, his eyes weren't on the traitor anymore. They were locked on hers, and for the first time, the mean boss looked like he was genuinely losing his focus. The cold champagne was a sticky, stinging reminder of her humiliation, but Kang-Dae's hand on her waist was the only thing keeping Hana upright. He led her away from the center of the ballroom, his face a mask of practiced irritation that signaled to the room he was taking his clumsy assistant to be dealt with in private. They slipped through a set of heavy velvet curtains and into a dimly lit service corridor that smelled of floor wax and expensive cigars. "The traitor took the bait," Kang-Dae whispered, his voice losing its performative edge and returning to that low, dangerous thrum. "He's moving toward the terrace to make his call. Wait here." He guided her toward a side exit that opened onto a quiet, cobblestone alleyway behind the venue. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic dripping from the eaves, and the air was sharp with the scent of damp earth. Hana leaned against the brick wall, the midnight blue silk of her dress feeling like a costume she was desperate to shed. She expected him to leave her there, to vanish into the shadows and finish his cold, calculated business. Instead, a commotion erupted at the far end of the alley. 2 men in black suits, men Hana recognized as part of Kang-Dae's own security detail, were looming over a small, weathered flower stall that sat tucked into a niche of the building. An elderly man, his back bowed by years of labor, was frantically trying to gather fallen carnations from the wet ground. One of the henchmen kicked a wooden crate aside, the sound of splintering would echoing in the narrow space. "You were told to clear out by 8, the henchman growled, his hand reaching for the old man's collar. "The boss doesn't like clutter near the exit. You're making us look bad." Hana held her breath, expecting Kang-Dae to step forward and finish what his men had started. He was a man who demanded perfection, a man who saw a ramen stain as a declaration of war. Surely, an old man and a pile of bruised flowers would be an eyesore he wouldn't tolerate. But Kang-Dae didn't join them. He walked into the light of the single street lamp, his silhouette long and imposing. Is there a problem here? The henchmen straightened immediately, their aggressive posture melting into rigid discipline. No, boss. Just clearing the way. This old fool didn't move his stall in time. Kang-Dae didn't look at his men. He looked at the shopkeeper, who was trembling so hard he nearly dropped the bunch of white roses in his hand. Kang-Dae stepped forward, and for a moment, Hana feared the worst. Then, the mean boss did something that made her heart skip a beat. He reached down and picked up a single, crushed carnation. He brushed the grit from its petals with a thumb that, only an hour ago, had been used to tilt Hana's chin with terrifying authority. Did he hit you? Kang-Dae asked. His voice wasn't the roar of a mob boss. It was a quiet, level frequency that was somehow even more frightening. No, sir. The old man stammered, his eyes downcast. I was just slow. My knees aren't what they used to be. Kang-Dae turned to his henchmen. The temperature in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. I pay you to protect my interests, not to bully grandfathers in the dark. If I see you use your hands on someone who cannot fight back again, you will find out exactly how I handle clutter in my organization. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clip of bills, and handed a significant stack to the stunned shopkeeper. For the crate, and for the flowers my man ruined. Thank you, sir. Thank you. The man breathed, clutching the money as if it were a miracle. Kang-Dae waved him off and turned back toward Hana. He caught her staring at him, her eyes wide with a realization she couldn't hide. The mean exterior, the obsession with silk and status, the cold demands. It was a suit of armor. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man who used the reputation of a monster to keep a very specific kind of order. As he walked back to her, the predatory glint in his amber eyes hadn't vanished, but it had changed. He stopped inches from her, the scent of sandalwood and rain-washed bricks swirling between them. He reached out, not to command her, but to pull the damp cardigan she'd been forced to keep around her shoulders a little tighter. Don't look at me like that, he murmured, his voice a rough silk. I'm still the man who is charging you $5,000 for a stain. I know, Hana whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. But I think you're also the man who knows exactly how much it hurts to have someone kick your crate over. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or terrifying. It was thick with a new kind of tension, a warmth that began in the small of her back where his hand still lingered. Kang-Dae didn't pull away. He looked down at her, his gaze lingering on her lips for a fraction of a second too long before he regained his composure. The traitor is on the terrace, he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Let's go finish this, assistant. We have a debt to settle. Hana followed him back into the gilded cage of the gala, but she wasn't walking behind a monster anymore. She was walking beside a man, and for the first time since the rain started, she wasn't sure she wanted to give the jacket back. The night didn't end with a clean getaway. Just as they reached the perimeter of the gala's parking structure, the silence was shattered by the screech of tires that didn't belong to a luxury sedan. A battered gray SUV veered across the exit, blocking their path. Hana didn't have time to scream before Kang-Dae's hand was a vice around her arm, pulling her down into the footwell of the car. Stay down, he growled, the calm she had witnessed in the alley vanishing into a cold, lethal focus. Through the tinted glass, Hana saw shadows moving, men with the same hungry, desperate energy as the vipers he had described. They weren't looking for the shipment logs anymore. They were looking at her. To the underworld, Kang-Dae's distraction at the gala had been too convincing. In their eyes, she wasn't a clumsy girl with a debt. She was the first vulnerability the king of Seoul had shown in a decade. The extraction was a blur of violent motion and the smell of burning rubber. Kang-Dae's driver didn't hesitate, ramming through the blockade with a sickening crunch of metal. They sped through the rain-slicked streets, weaving through traffic until the city lights began to thin into the dark, wooded hills of the outskirts. They saw me with you, Hana whispered, her voice trembling as she sat back up, her hair a wild mess against the midnight blue silk. They think I'm someone important. They think you're my heart, Kang-Dae corrected, his voice flat, but his eyes tracking the side mirrors. which makes you a target they can use to negotiate. My apartment isn't safe for you anymore, and neither is your studio. We're going to the mountain estate. The estate was less of a home and more of a fortress carved from glass and slate. It sat perched on a cliffside, surrounded by a high perimeter fence and guards who moved like ghosts in the dark. By the time they reached the inner sanctum, the adrenaline had left Hana feeling hollow and freezing. This is the secure wing, Kang-Dae said, leading her into a suite that was vastly different from his office. It was warmer, filled with the scent of cedar and aged bourbon, but the windows were reinforced and the door locked with a heavy, digital thud. Hana looked around the room, her eyes landing on the center of the space. There was a wide, low-profile bed draped in heavy charcoal linens, illuminated by a single, soft light. There were no other doors except for the bathroom. Where am I supposed to sleep? She asked, her voice small. Kang-Dae began to unbutton his tuxedo jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He tossed the garment onto a leather chair, standing in his white dress shirt, the silk straining against his shoulders. In here, this wing has an independent oxygen supply and a reinforced frame. It's the only place the Vipers can't reach with a localized strike. Hana stared at the single bed. Both of us. I am the only one who can protect you if the perimeter is breached, he said, turning to look at her. The mean boss was back, but there was a weariness in the line of his shoulders that he hadn't shown at the gala. You took my coat to stay dry, Hana. Now you have to stay in my shadow to stay alive. Don't look at me like that. I'm too tired to be a monster tonight. He didn't wait for her to argue. He walked to the far side of the bed, sat down, and began to remove his shoes. The forced proximity felt like a physical pressure, a weight in the air that made every breath Hana took feel loud and intrusive. She moved tentatively to the edge of the mattress, perching there as if she were ready to bolt. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the hum of the security system. Hana lay down, still in her blue dress, her back turned to him. She expected to feel terrified, to feel the same cold dread that had gripped her when she first saw the burner phone. But as she felt the mattress shift when Kang-Dae lay down on the other side, she didn't feel the urge to run. Instead, she felt the radiating heat of him, a steady, grounding presence in a world that had suddenly turned violent. Hana, he murmured into the dark. Yes. The debt just went up, he said, his voice a low, tired rasp. Protecting you from a war is much more expensive than a silk lining. I know, she whispered, closing her eyes. But I think I'm okay with being in your debt for a little longer. She didn't see the ghost of a smile that touched his lips before he reached out and turned off the light, leaving them alone in a fortress that suddenly felt like the only home she had left. The morning light at the mountain estate was different from the city's neon glare. It was cold, sharp, and silver, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling glass in long, silent blades. Hana woke alone in the massive bed, the charcoal linens still holding a trace of Kang-Dae's scent, that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and something like ozone before a storm. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the faint, rhythmic hum of the estate's security servers. On the leather armchair across the room, the charcoal gray trench coat sat waiting. It looked less like a garment and more like an abandoned shell, its silver tiger crest catching the morning sun. Hana approached it tentatively. The orange ramen stain was still there, a jagged, ugly mark against the perfection of the silk lining. To Kang-Dae, it was a $5,000 insult. To Hana, it was the reason she was still alive. She had told him she was an illustrator, but she hadn't mentioned that before the world turned its back on her, she had spent a year apprenticing with a traditional hanbok maker, learning the meticulous art of needlework. I can't pay him in cash, she whispered to the empty room, but I can pay him in care. A polite request to one of the stone-faced guards yielded a lacquered wooden valet box. Inside was a collection of silk threads that shimmered like liquid jewels and needles so fine they felt like whispers of steel. Hana sat by the window, the heavy coat draped across her lap, and began her work. She worked with the focus of a surgeon. First, she used a specialized solvent from the kit to lift the worst of the staining, her fingers moving with a grace she hadn't felt in months. Then, she began the restoration. Instead of just patching the silk, she used her illustrator's eye to blend shades of silver, slate, and pearl, reweaving the damaged fibers until the stain vanished into the grain of the fabric. But as she reached the end, her hand hesitated near the silver tiger crest. Kang-Dae was a man who lived in the shadows, a man whose mean exterior was a suit of armor designed to keep the world at bay. Yet, she remembered him in the alley, the way he had touched a bruised carnation with more tenderness than anyone had ever shown her. She remembered the way he had stepped into the line of fire for a girl who had done nothing but cause him trouble. She threaded a needle with a single, translucent strand of white silk. Hidden just beneath the shadow of the tiger's paw, inside the lining where only the wearer would know it existed, she began to sew. She didn't draw a design first. She let her hand remember the white roses from the old man's stall. Slowly, a tiny, delicate flower bloomed against the charcoal wool, a blossom so small and subtle it looked like a trick of the light. It was a thank you sewn in secret, a piece of her soul tucked into his fortress. Hours passed. The sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting the room in a bruised purple hue. The door hummed and slid open. Kang-Dae stood in the threshold, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked like a man who had spent the day deciding lives and deaths. He stopped when he saw her, the coat still draped over her knees, the silver needle held between her fingers. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice a low, tired thrum that vibrated in the quiet room. "Paying my debt," Hana said, her voice steady. She stood up and held the coat out to him. He walked toward her, his presence closing the distance until the air between them felt thick enough to touch. He took the jacket, his long fingers immediately finding the spot where the stain had been. He ran his thumb over the silk, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as he realized the blemish was gone, not just cleaned, but erased by a master's hand. "You fixed it," he murmured. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his amber eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I did," she said. He didn't see the flower yet. He didn't know that he was now carrying a piece of her gratitude against his heart. He simply stepped closer, his hand lingering on the lapel, his thumb brushing the fabric just inches from her throat. "The tailor in Milan will be disappointed," Kang-Dae whispered, his voice dropping into that dangerous, intimate frequency. "He's just lost his best customer to a girl who hides in the rain." He didn't pull away. In the dimming light of the fortress, the mean boss and the clumsy assistant stood in a silence that was no longer cold. It was a promise. The peace of the mountain estate was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the sterile, insistent chiming of the security terminal. The Vipers hadn't come for a siege. They had come for a parley, emboldened by the belief that they held Kang-Dae's shipments and his supposed heart in a terminal grip. 3 hours later, Hana stood in the shadowed corner of a high-ceilinged warehouse near the docks, the salt-heavy air of the pier biting through her thin cardigan. Kang-Dae stood at the center of the concrete floor, his silhouette framed by the towering stacks of shipping containers. Across from him stood Director Lim, the man from the gala whose eyes had been too sharp and whose smile had been too smooth. Behind him, a dozen armed men waited like coiled springs, their presence a silent threat in the echoing space. "The coordinates on the burner phone led us right to the motherlode," Kang-Dae, Lim said, his voice dripping with the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he had finally outplayed a king. "By dawn, your entire European distribution line will be under new management. You've become distracted. Soft. All for a girl who doesn't even know how to wear your clothes." Kang-Dae didn't move. He looked like a statue of obsidian, his hands shoved casually into the pockets of the restored charcoal trench coat. "You think a single phone and a girl's mistake are enough to dismantle 10 years of work? I think the logs don't lie," Lim countered, holding up a tablet. "I've seen the manifests. I've seen the timestamps for Pier 4. You're finished." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a trigger pull away from a massacre. Hana felt the cold sweat on her palms, but as she looked at the tablet in Lim's hand, a memory sparked, not of art or embroidery, but of the hundreds of boring logistical files Kang-Dae had forced her to sort through during her first days of debt collection. He had called it busy work, a way to make her feel the weight of her $5,000 burden. She stepped out of the shadows, her silver heels clicking sharply on the concrete. Every gun in the room pivoted toward her, But she didn't stop until she was standing just behind Kang-Dae's shoulder. The manifests for Pier 4 were for the 2024 fiscal cycle, she said, her voice surprisingly clear in the cavernous room. Lim frowned, his eyes darting to her. What are you talking about, girl? I was the one who filed the digital archives yesterday, Hana continued, leaning into the clumsy assistant persona just enough to make him underestimate her. The coordinates on that burner phone? They weren't for a live shipment. They were for the ghost containers, the ones designated for the customs graveyard because of the 2025 maritime tax audit. If your men are at Pier 4 right now, they aren't opening crates of high-end electronics. They're opening 40-ton containers of industrial scrap metal and expired medical waste. The silence that followed was absolute. Kang-Dae didn't look back at her, but she saw the slight, predatory tilt of his head. The insurance filings, Hana added, looking directly at Lim. You should have checked the subledger I processed this morning. The real shipment was rerouted through Incheon 3 days ago, under a subsidiary name that isn't even in your database. I know, because I spent 6 hours correcting the boring clerical errors on the routing slips. Lim's face turned a mottled, sickly shade of gray. He frantically tapped at his tablet, his hands shaking. A moment later, his phone rang, a frantic report from his men at the docks. The crates were empty. The trap was a void of red tape and administrative shadows. Kang-Dae stepped forward then, the heavy wool of his coat swinging with a lethal grace. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He had used a girl's eye for detail to render an army obsolete. You spent so much time looking for the tiger, Kang-Dae said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration, that you forgot to watch the person who handles the paperwork. In my world, Lim, an error in a ledger is more fatal than a bullet. With a flick of his wrist, Kang-Dae signaled his own men, who emerged from the darkness of the warehouse rafters. The Vipers, realizing they were surrounded by a man who had outthought them before the first shot was even fired, began to lower their weapons. Kang-Dae turned then, his amber eyes locking onto Hana's. The mean boss was still there, but beneath the ice, there was a flash of something that looked dangerously like pride. He reached out, his hand lingering on the lapel of the jacket, right where her secret flower was hidden, and pulled her closer into his shadow. It seems, he murmured, loud enough only for her to hear, that I've vastly undervalued your services, assistant. The morning after the warehouse showdown was unnervingly quiet. The city of Seoul was waking up, oblivious to the fact that its hierarchy had been rewritten in the silence of a shipping graveyard. Hana stood in the center of Kang-Dae's office, the charcoal gray trench coat draped over her arm. It was perfect now, the stain gone, the silk restored, and a secret white rose tucked forever beneath the silver tiger's paw. Kang-Dae stood by the window, his back to her. The sunlight caught the sharp, uncompromising line of his shoulders. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with everything that hadn't been said in the fortress. The shared warmth of the mountain estate, the way he had shielded her from the Vipers, and the way she had saved his empire with nothing but a sharp eye for clerical errors. The logs have been reconciled, Kang-Dae said, his voice a low, steady thrum. He turned to face her, his amber eyes unreadable. The information you provided saved the Kang group more than 10 times the value of that coat. Your debt isn't just paid, Hana. It's obliterated. He stepped toward her, stopping just close enough for her to catch that familiar, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and winter air. He reached out and took the jacket from her arm. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, electric contact that made her heart stutter. He looked down at the garment, his thumb tracing the lapel right where she knew the flower was hidden. You're free to go, he said. The words should have felt like a victory, but they felt like a door slamming shut. My driver is waiting downstairs to take you back to your apartment. Your life can go back to normal. Normal, Hana repeated, the word tasting like ash. Normal meant empty interviews and cold ramen in a cramped studio. It meant a world where the rain was just water, not a catalyst for meeting a man who was a monster to everyone but her. Thank you, Mr. Kang. Kang-Dae, he corrected softly. She nodded, gathered her pride, and walked out of the obsidian and glass temple. Her apartment felt smaller than she remembered. The ceiling seemed lower, the walls more fragile. She spent the afternoon staring at her drawing tablet, But the only thing she wanted to sketch was the sharp angle of a jawline and a pair of predatory amber eyes. She was about to brew a pot of tea when she noticed something draped over her small, rickety kitchen chair. It was a coat, but not the one she had borrowed. This was a long, heavy overcoat made of midnight black cashmere, with buttons carved from dark horn and a lining that felt like a cloud. It was unmistakably his. It radiated his heat, his authority, and that lingering, masculine scent that had become her only sense of safety. Her heart hammered as she grabbed her old phone and dialed the number she had memorized from the gold-plated burner. It rang only once. "You left your coat," she said, her voice trembling. "The black one. You left it at my place when your driver dropped off my things. It must have been an accident." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Kang-Dae finally spoke, his voice was no longer the cold, mean boss of the Kang group. It was the man from the mountain, the one who protected grandfathers and kept a girl's secret in his silk. "I don't believe in accidents, Hana," he murmured, the sound of his voice sending a familiar shiver down her spine. "I only believe in provocations." Hana gripped the phone tighter, a small, hopeful smile breaking through her fear. "Then what is this? A provocation?" "It's a reason," he replied, and she could almost hear the dark, predatory tilt of his smile. "Keep the coat for tonight. I'll need an excuse to come see you tomorrow." Hana looked at the midnight black fabric, realizing then that she hadn't just returned a jacket. She had stepped into a permanent wardrobe, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the rain.